Section 6 of Chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 21, Section 6. Villeroy had, in the meantime, made some petty conquests. Dixmuyde, which might have offered some resistance, had opened its gates to him, not without grave suspicion of treachery on the part of the governor. Deynse, which was less able to make any defence, had followed the example. The garrisons of both towns were, in violation of a convention which had been made for the exchange of prisoners, sent into France. The Marshal then advanced towards Brussels, in the hope that, as it should seem that by menacing that beautiful capital he might induce the allies to raise the siege of the castle of Namur. During 36 hours he rained shells and red-hot bullets on the city. The Electress of Bavaria, who was within the walls, miscarried from terror. 6 convents perished. 1,500 houses were at once in flames. The whole lower town would have been burned to the ground, had not the inhabitants stopped the conflagration by blowing up numerous buildings. Immense quantities of the finest lace and tapestry were destroyed, for the industry and trade which makes Brussels famous throughout the world had hitherto been little affected by the war. Several of the stately piles which looked down on the market-place were laid in ruins. The town hall itself, the noblest of the many noble senate houses reared by the burghers of the Netherlands, was in imminent peril. All this devastation, however, produced no effect except much private misery. William was not to be intimidated or provoked into relaxing the firm grasp with which he held Namur. The fire which his batteries kept up round the castle was such as had never been known in war. The French gunners were fairly driven from their pieces by the hail of balls, and forced to take refuge in vaulted galleries under the ground. Cohorn exultingly betted the Elector of Bavaria 400 pistoles that the place would fall before the 31st of August, new style. The great engineer lost his wager indeed, but lost it only by a few hours. Boufflers now began to feel that his only hope was in Villeroy. Villeroy had proceeded from Brussels to Enghien. He had there collected all the French troops that could be spared from the remotest fortresses of the Netherlands, and he now, at the head of more than 80,000 men, marched towards Namur. Vaudemont meanwhile joined the besiegers. William therefore thought himself strong enough to offer battle to Villeroy, without intermitting for a moment the operations against Boufflers. The Elector of Bavaria was entrusted with the immediate direction of the siege. The King of England took up, on the west of the town, a strong position strongly entrenched, and there awaited the French, who were advancing from Enghien. Everything seemed to indicate that a great day was at hand. 2 of the most numerous and best ordered armies that Europe had ever seen were brought face to face. On the 15th of August, the defenders of the castle saw from their watchtowers the mighty host of their countrymen. But between that host and the citadel was drawn up in battle order the not less mighty host of William. Villeroy, by a salute of 90 guns, conveyed to Boufflers the promise of a speedy rescue, and at night Boufflers, by fire signals, which was seen far over the vast plain of the Meuse and Sambre, urged Villeroy to fulfil that promise without delay. In the capitals both of France and England the anxiety was intense. Lewis shut himself up in his oratory, confessed, received the Eucharist, and gave orders that the host should be exposed in his chapel. His wife ordered all her nuns to their knees. London was kept in a state of distraction by a succession of rumours fabricated, some by Jacobites and some by stockjobbers. Early one morning it was confidently averred that there had been a battle, that the allies had been beaten, that the king had been killed, that the siege had been raised. The Exchange, as soon as it was opened, was filled to overflowing by people who came to learn whether the bad news was true. The streets were stopped up all day by groups of talkers and listeners. In the afternoon the Gazette, which had been impatiently expected, and which was eagerly read by thousands, calmed the excitement, but not completely, for it was known that the Jacobites sometimes received, by the agency of privateers and smugglers who put to sea in all weathers, intelligence earlier than that which came through regular channels to the Secretary of State at Whitehall. Before night, however, the agitation had altogether subsided, but it was suddenly revived by a bold imposture. A horseman in the uniform of the Guards spurred through the city, announcing that the King had been killed. He would probably have raised a serious tumult, had not some apprentices, zealous for the Revolution and the Protestant religion, knocked him down and carried him to Newgate. The confidential correspondent of the States General informed that, in spite of all the stories which the disaffected party invented and circulated, the general persuasion was that the allies would be successful. A touchstone of sincerity in England, he said, was the betting. The Jacobites were ready enough to prove that William must be defeated, or to assert that he had been defeated, but they would not give the odds, and could hardly be induced to take any moderate odds. The Whigs, on the other hand, were ready to stake thousands of guineas on the conduct and good fortune of the King. The event justified the confidence of the Whigs and the backwardness of the Jacobites. On the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th of August, the army of Villeroy and the army of William confronted each other. It was fully expected that the 19th would be the decisive day. The allies were under arms before dawn. At 4 William mounted, and continued till 8 at night to ride from post to post, disposing his own troops and watching the movements of the enemy. The enemy approached his lines in several places, near enough to see that it would not be easy to dislodge him, but there was no fighting. He lay down to rest, expecting to be attacked when the sun rose. But when the sun rose, he found that the French had fallen back some miles. He immediately sent to request that the Elector would storm the castle without delay. While the preparations were making, Portland was sent to summon the garrison for the last time. It was plain, he said to Boufflers, that Villeroy had given up all hope of being able to raise the siege. It would therefore be a useless waste of life to prolong the contest. Boufflers, however, thought that another day of slaughter was necessary to the honour of the French arms, and Portland returned unsuccessful. Early in the afternoon, the assault was made in 4 places at once by 4 divisions of the Confederate army. One point was assigned to the Brandenburgers, another to the Dutch, a third to the Bavarians, and a fourth to the English. The English were at first less fortunate than they had hitherto been. The truth is that most of the regiments which had seen service had marched with William to encounter Villeroy. As soon as the signal was given by the blowing up of 2 barrels of powder, Cutts, at the head of a small body of grenadiers, marched first out of the trenches with drums beating and colours flying. This gallant band was to be supported by 4 battalions which had never been in action, and which, though full of spirit, wanted the steadiness which so terrible a service required. The officers fell fast. Every colonel, every lieutenant colonel was killed or severely wounded. Cutts received a shot in the head, which for a time disabled him. The raw recruits, left almost without direction, rushed forward impetuously till they found themselves in disorder and out of breath, with a precipice before them, under a terrible fire, and under a shower less terrible of fragments of rock and wall. They lost heart, and rolled back in confusion, till Cutts, whose wound had by this time been dressed, succeeded in rallying them. He then led them, not to the place from which they had been driven back, but to another spot where a fearful battle was raging. The Bavarians had made their onset gallantly, but unsuccessfully. Their general had fallen, and they were beginning to waver when the arrival of the Salamander and his men changed the fate of the day. 200 English volunteers, bent on retrieving at all hazards the disgrace of the recent repulse, were the first to force a way, sword in hand, through the palisades, to storm a battery which had made great havoc among the Bavarians, and to turn the guns against the garrison. Meanwhile the Brandenburgers, excellently disciplined and excellently commanded, had performed with no great loss the duty assigned to them. The Dutch had been equally successful. When the evening closed in, the allies had made a lodgment of a mile in extent on the outworks of the castle. The advantage had been purchased by the loss of 2,000 men. And now Boufflers thought that he had done all that his duty required. On the morrow he asked for a truce of 48 hours, in order that the hundreds of corpses which choked the ditches, and which would have soon spread pestilence among both the besiegers and the besieged, might be removed and interred. His request was granted, and before the time expired he intimated that he was disposed to capitulate. He would, he said, deliver up the castle in 10 days, if he were not relieved sooner. He was informed that the allies would not treat with him on such terms, and that he must either consent to an immediate surrender or prepare for an immediate assault. He yielded, and it was agreed that he and his men should be suffered to depart, leaving the citadel, the artillery, and the stores to the conquerors. 3 peals from all the guns of the Confederate army notified to Villeroy the fall of the stronghold which he had vainly attempted to succour. He instantly retreated towards Mons, leaving William to enjoy undisturbed a triumph which was made more delightful by the recollection of many misfortunes. The 26th of August was fixed for an exhibition such as the oldest soldier in Europe had never seen, and such as, a few weeks before, the youngest had scarcely hoped to see. From the first battle of Conde to the last battle of Luxembourg, the tide of military success had run, without any serious interruption, in one direction. That tide had turned. For the first time, men said, since France had marshals, a Marshal of France was to deliver up a fortress to a victorious enemy. The allied forces, foot and horse, drawn up in 2 lines, formed a magnificent avenue from the breach which had lately been so desperately contested to the bank of the Meuse. The Elector of Bavaria, the Landgrave of Hesse, and many distinguished officers were on horseback in the vicinity of the castle. William was near them in his coach. The garrison, reduced to about 5,000 men, came forth with drums beating and ensigns flying. Boufflers and his staff closed the procession. There had been some difficulty about the form of the greeting which was to be exchanged between him and the allied sovereigns. An Elector of Bavaria was hardly entitled to be saluted by the Marshal with the sword. A King of England was undoubtedly entitled to such a mark of respect. But France did not recognise William as King of England. At last Boufflers consented to perform the salute, without marking for which of the two princes it was intended. He lowered his sword. William alone acknowledged the compliment. A short conversation followed. The Marshal, in order to avoid the use of the words Sire and Majesty, addressed himself only to the Elector. The Elector, with every mark of deference, reported to William what had been said, and William gravely touched his hat. The officers of the garrison carried back to their country the news that the upstart who at Paris was designated only as Prince of Orange was treated by the proudest potentates of the Germanic body with a respect as profound as that which Lewis exacted from the gentlemen of his bedchamber. The ceremonial was now over, and Boufflers passed on, but he had proceeded but a short way when he was stopped by Dykvelt, who accompanied the allied army as deputy from the States General. "You must return to the town, sir," said Dykvelt. "The King of England has informed me to inform you that you are his prisoner." Boufflers was in transports of rage. His officers crowded round him and vowed to die in his defence. But resistance was out of the question. A strong body of Dutch cavalry came up, and the brigadier who commanded them demanded the Marshal's sword. The Marshal uttered indignant exclamations. "This is an infamous breach of faith. Look at the terms of the capitulation. What have I done to deserve such an affront? Have I not behaved like a man of honour? Ought I not to be treated as such? But beware what you do, gentlemen. I serve a master who can and will avenge me." "I am a soldier, sir," answered the brigadier, "and my business is to obey orders without troubling myself about consequences." Dykvelt calmly and courteously replied to the Marshal's indignant exclamations. "The King of England has reluctantly followed the example set by your master." The soldiers who garrisoned Dixmuyde and Deynse have, in defiance of plighted faith, been sent prisoners into France. The prince whom they serve would be wanting in his duty to them if he did not retaliate. His Majesty might with perfect justice have detained all the French who were in Namur, but he will not follow to such a length a precedent which he disapproves. He has determined to arrest you and you alone, and, sir, you must not regard as an affront what is in truth a mark of his very particular esteem. How can he pay you a higher compliment than by showing that he considers you as fully equivalent to the 5,000 or 6,000 men whom your sovereign wrongfully holds in captivity? Nay, you shall even now be permitted to proceed, if you will give me your word of honour to return hither unless the garrisons of Dixmuyde and Deynse are released within a fortnight." "I do not at all know," answered Boufflers, "why the King my master detains these men, and therefore I cannot hold out any hope that he will liberate them. You have an army at your back. I am alone, and you must do your pleasure." He gave up his sword, returned to Namur, and was sent thence to Huy, where he passed a few days in luxurious repose, was allowed to choose his own walks and rides, and was treated with marked respect by those who guarded him. In the shortest time in which it was possible to post from the place where he was confined to the French court and back again, he received full powers to promise that the garrisons of Dixmuyde and Deynse should be sent back. He was instantly liberated, and he set off for Fontainebleau, where an honourable reception awaited him. He was created a duke and a peer. That he might be able to support his new dignities, a considerable sum of money was bestowed on him, and in the presence of the whole aristocracy of France he was welcomed home by Lewis with an affectionate embrace. In all the countries which were united against France, the news of the fall of Namur was received with joy, but here the exultation was greatest. During several generations our ancestors had achieved nothing considerable by land against foreign enemies. We had indeed occasionally furnished to our allies small bands of auxiliaries who had well maintained the honour of the nation. But from the day on which the two brave Talbots, father and son, had perished in the vain attempt to reconquer Guienne, till the Revolution, there had been on the Continent no campaign in which Englishmen had borne a principal part. At length our ancestors had again, after an interval of near 2 centuries and a half, begun to dispute with the warriors of France the palm of military prowess. The struggle had been hard. The genius of Luxemburg and the consummate discipline of the household troops of Lewis had prevailed in 2 great battles, but the event of those battles had been long doubtful. The victory had been dearly purchased, and the victor had gained little more than the honour of remaining master of the field of slaughter. Meanwhile he was himself training his adversaries. The recruits who survived his severe tuition speedily became veterans. Steinkirk and Landen had formed the volunteers who followed Cutts through the palisades of Namur. The judgment of all the great warriors whom the nations of Western Europe had sent to the confluence of the Sambre and the Meuse was that the English subaltern was inferior to no subaltern, and the English private soldier to no private soldier in Christendom. The English officers of higher rank were thought hardly worthy to command such an army. Cutts, indeed, had distinguished himself by his intrepidity, but those who most admire him acknowledged that he had neither the capacity nor the science necessary to a general. The joy of the conquerors was heightened by the recollection of the discomfiture which they had suffered 3 years before on the same spot, and of the insolence with which their enemy had then triumphed over them. They now triumphed in their turn. The Dutch struck medals, the Spaniards sang Te Deums, many poems, serious and sportive, appeared, of which only one has lived. Prior burlesqued, with admirable spirit and pleasantry, the bombastic verses in which Boileau had celebrated the first taking of Namur. The 2 odes, printed side by side, were read with delight in London, and the critics at Will's pronounced that in wit as in arms England had been victorious. The fall of Namur was the great military event of this year. The Turkish war still kept a large part of the forces of the Emperor employed in indecisive operations on the Danube. Nothing deserving to be mentioned took place either in Piedmont or on the Rhine. In Catalonia the Spaniards obtained some slight advantages due to their English and Dutch allies, who seem to have done all that could be done to help a nation never much disposed to help itself. The maritime superiority of England and Holland was now fully established. During the whole year Russell was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, passed and repassed between Spain and Italy, bombarded Palamos, spread terror along the whole shore of Provence, and kept the French fleet imprisoned in the harbour of Toulon. Meanwhile Berkeley was the undisputed master of the Channel, sailed to and fro in sight of the coasts of Artois, Picardy, Normandy and Brittany, threw shells into St. Malo, Calais and Dunkirk, and burned Granville to the ground. The navy of Lewis, which 5 years before had been the most formidable in Europe, which had ranged the British seas unopposed from the Downs to the Land's End, which had anchored in Torbay and had laid Teignmouth in ashes, now gave no sign of existence except by pillaging merchantmen which were unprovided with convoy. In this lucrative war the French privateers were, towards the close of the summer, very successful. Several vessels laden with sugar from Barbados were captured. The losses of the unfortunate East India Company, already surrounded by difficulties and impoverished by boundless prodigality and corruption, were enormous. 5 large ships returning from the eastern seas, with cargoes of which the value was popularly estimated at £1,000,000, fell into the hands of the enemy. These misfortunes produced some murmuring on the Royal Exchange; but on the whole the temper of the capital and of the nation was better than it had been during some years. Meanwhile, events which no preceding historian has condescended to mention, but which were of far greater importance than the achievements of William's army or of Russell's fleet, were taking place in London. A great experiment was making. A great revolution was in progress. Newspapers had made their appearance. End of section 6. Of chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, chapter 21, section 7. While the Licensing Act was in force, there was no newspaper in England except the London Gazette, which was edited by a clerk in the office of the Secretary of State, and which contained nothing but what the Secretary of State wished the nation to know. There were indeed many periodical papers, but none of those papers could be called a newspaper. Wellwood, a zealous Whig, published a journal called the Observator, but his Observator, like the Observator which Lestrange had formerly edited, contained not the news, but merely dissertations on politics. A crazy bookseller, named John Dunton, published the Athenian Mercury, but the Athenian Mercury merely discussed questions of natural philosophy, of casuistry, and of gallantry. A Fellow of the Royal Society, named John Houghton, published what he called a collection for the improvement of history and trade, but his collection contained little more than the prices of stocks, explanations of the modes of doing business in the city, puffs of new projects, and advertisements of books, quack medicines, chocolate, spa water, civet cats, surgeons wanting ships, valets wanting masters, and ladies wanting husbands. If ever he printed any political news, he transcribed it from the Gazette. The Gazette was so partial and so meagre a chronicle of events that, though it had no competitors, it had but a small circulation. Only 8,000 copies were printed, much less than one to each parish in the kingdom. In truth, a person who had studied the history of his own time only in the Gazette would have been ignorant of many events of the highest importance. He would, for example, have known nothing about the court-martial on Torrington, the Lancashire trials, the burning of the Bishop of Salisbury's pastoral letter, or the impeachment of the Duke of Leeds. But the deficiencies of the Gazette were to a certain extent supplied in London by the coffeehouses and in the country by the newsletters. On the 3rd of May 1695, the law which had subjected the press to a censorship expired. Within a fortnight, a stanch old Whig named Harris, who had in the days of the Exclusion Bill attempted to set up a newspaper entitled Intelligence, Domestic and Foreign, and who had been speedily forced to relinquish that design, announced that the Intelligence, Domestic and Foreign, suppressed 14 years before by tyranny, would again appear. 10 days after the first number of the Intelligence, Domestic and Foreign was printed the first number of the English Courant. Then came the packet boat from Holland and Flanders, the Pegasus, the London Newsletter, the London Post, the Flying Post, the Old Postmaster, the Postboy, and the Postman. The history of the newspapers of England from that time to the present day is a most interesting and instructive part of the history of the country. At first they were small and mean-looking. Even the Postboy and the Postman, which seem to have been the best conducted and the most prosperous, were wretchedly printed on scraps of dingy paper, such as would not now be thought good enough for street ballads. Only 2 numbers came out in a week, and a number contained little more matter than may be found in a single column of a daily paper of our time. What is now called a leading article seldom appeared, except when there was a scarcity of intelligence, when the Dutch mails were detained by the west wind, when the Rapparees were quiet in the Bog of Allen, when no stage-coach had been stopped by highwaymen, when no non-juring congregation had been dispersed by constables, when no ambassador had made his entry with a long train of coaches and six, when no lord or poet had been buried in the Abbey, and when consequently it was difficult to fill up 4 scanty pages. Yet the leading articles, though inserted, as it should seem, only in the absence of more attractive matter, are by no means contemptibly written. It is a remarkable fact that the infant newspapers were all on the side of King William and the Revolution. This fact may be partly explained by the circumstance that the editors were, at first, on their good behaviour. It was by no means clear that their trade was not in itself illegal. The printing of newspapers was certainly not prohibited by any statute. But, towards the close of the reign of Charles II, the judges had pronounced that it was a misdemeanour at common law to publish political intelligence without the King's licence. It is true that the judges who laid down this doctrine were removable at the royal pleasure, and were eager on all occasions to exalt the royal prerogative. How the question, if it were again raised, would be decided by Holt and Treby was doubtful, and the effect of the doubt was to make the ministers of the Crown indulgent and to make the journalists cautious. On neither side was there a wish to bring the question of right to issue. The government therefore connived at the publication of the newspapers, and the conductors of the newspapers carefully abstained from publishing anything that could provoke or alarm the government. It is true that in one of the earliest numbers of one of the new journals a paragraph appeared which seemed intended to convey an insinuation that the Princess Anne did not sincerely rejoice at the fall of Namur. But the printer made haste to atone for his fault by the most submissive apologies. During a considerable time the unofficial gazettes, though much more garrulous and amusing than the official gazette, were scarcely less courtly. Whoever examines them will find that the King is always mentioned with profound respect. About the debates and divisions of the two Houses a reverential silence is preserved. There is much invective, but it is almost all directed against the Jacobites and the French. It seems certain that the government of William gained not a little by the substitution of these printed newspapers, composed under constant dread of the Attorney General, for the old newsletters which were written with unbounded license. The pamphleteers were under less restraint than the journalists. Yet no person who has studied with attention the political controversies of that time can have failed to perceive that the libels on William's person and government were decidedly less coarse and rancorous during the latter half of his reign than during the earlier half. And the reason evidently is that the press, which had been fettered during the earlier half of his reign, was free during the latter half. While the censorship existed, no tract blaming, even in the most temperous and decorous language, the conduct of any public department, was likely to be printed with the approbation of the licenser. To print such a tract without the approbation of the licenser was illegal. In general, therefore, the respectable and moderate opponents of the court, not being able to publish in the manner prescribed by law, and not thinking it right or safe to publish in a manner prohibited by law, held their peace, and left the business of criticising the administration to two classes of men: fanatical nonjurors who sincerely thought that the Prince of Orange was entitled to as little charity or courtesy as the Prince of Darkness, and Grub Street hacks, coarse-minded, bad-hearted, and foul-mouthed. Thus there was scarcely a single man of judgment, temper, and integrity among the many who were in the habit of writing against the government. Indeed, the habit of writing against the government had of itself an unfavourable effect on the character. For whoever was in the habit of writing against the government was in the habit of breaking the law, and the habit of breaking even an unreasonable law tends to make men altogether lawless. However absurd a tariff may be, a smuggler is but too likely to be a knave and a ruffian. However oppressive a game law may be, the transition is but too easy from a poacher to a murderer. And so, though little indeed can be said in favour of the statutes which imposed restraints on literature, there was much risk that a man who was constantly violating those statutes would not be a man of high honour and rigid uprightness. An author who was determined to print and could not obtain the sanction of the licenser must employ the services of needy and desperate outcasts, who, hunted by the peace officers and forced to assume every week new aliases and new disguises, hid their paper and their types in those dens of vice which are the pest and the shame of great capitals. Such wretches as these he must bribe to keep his secret and to run the chance of having their backs flayed and their ears clipped in his stead. A man stooping to such companions and to such expedients could hardly retain unimpaired the delicacy of his sense of what was right and becoming. The emancipation of the press produced a great and salutary change. The best and wisest men in the ranks of the opposition now assumed an office which had hitherto been abandoned to the unprincipled or the hot-headed. Tracts against the government were written in a style not becoming statesmen and gentlemen, and even the compositions of the lower and fiercer class of malcontents became somewhat less brutal and less ribald than in the days of the licensers. Some weak men had imagined that religion and morality stood in need of the protection of the licenser. The event signally proved that they were in error. In truth, the censorship had scarcely put any restraint on licentiousness or profaneness. The Paradise Lost had narrowly escaped mutilation, for the Paradise Lost was the work of a man whose politics were hateful to the ruling powers. But Etheridge's She Would If She Could, Wycherley's Country Wife, Dryden's translations from the fourth book of Lucretius obtained the imprimatur without difficulty, for Dryden, Etheridge, and Wycherley were courtiers. From the day on which the emancipation of our literature was accomplished, the purification of our literature began. That purification was effected, not by the intervention of senates or magistrates, but by the opinion of the great body of educated Englishmen, before whom good and evil were set, and who were left free to make their choice. During 160 years, the liberty of our press has been constantly becoming more and more entire, and during these 160 years the restraint imposed on writers by the general feeling of readers has been constantly becoming more and more strict. At length, even that class of works in which it was formerly thought that a voluptuous imagination was privileged to disport itself, love songs, comedies, novels, have become more decorous than the sermons of the 17th century. At this day, foreigners, who dare not print a word reflecting on the government under which they live, are at a loss to understand how it happens that the freest press in Europe is the most prudish. End of section 7. Of chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 21, Section 8. On the 10th of October, the King, leaving his army in winter quarters, arrived in England, and was received with unwonted enthusiasm. During his passage through the capital to his palace, the bells of every church were ringing, and every street was lighted up. It was late before he made his way through the shouting crowds to Kensington, but late as it was, a council was instantly held. An important point was to be decided. Should the House of Commons be permitted to sit again, or should there be an immediate dissolution? The King would probably have been willing to keep that House to the end of his reign, but this was not in his power. The Triennial Act had fixed the 25th of March as the latest day of the existence of the Parliament. If therefore there were not a general election in 1695, there must be a general election in 1696. And who could say what might be the state of the country in 1696? There might be an unfortunate campaign. There might be, indeed there was, but too good reason to believe that there would be, a terrible commercial crisis. In either case it was probable that there would be much ill humour. The campaign of 1695 had been brilliant. The nation was in an excellent temper, and William wisely determined to seize the fortunate moment. 2 proclamations were immediately published. One of them announced, in the ordinary form, that His Majesty had determined to dissolve the old Parliament, and had ordered writs to be issued for a new Parliament. The other proclamation was unprecedented. It signified the royal pleasure to be that every regiment quartered in a place where an election was to be held should march out of that place the day before the nomination, and should not return till the people had made their choice. From this order, which was generally considered as indicating a laudable respect for popular rights, the garrisons of fortified towns and castles were necessarily excepted. But, though William carefully abstained from disgusting the constituent bodies by anything that could look like coercion or intimidation, he did not disdain to influence their votes by milder means. He resolved to spend the 6 weeks of the general election in showing himself to the people of many districts which he had never yet visited. He hoped to acquire in this way a popularity which might have a considerable effect on the returns. He therefore forced himself to behave with a graciousness and affability in which he was too often deficient, and the consequence was that he received, at every stage of his progress, marks of the goodwill of his subjects. Before he set out, he paid a visit in form to his sister-in-law, and was much pleased with his reception. The Duke of Gloucester, only 6 years old, with a little musket on his shoulder, came to meet his uncle and presented arms. "I am learning my drill," the child said, "that I may help you beat the French." The King laughed much, and a few days later rewarded the young soldier with the Garter. On the 17th of October, William went to Newmarket, now a place rather of business than of pleasure, but in the autumns of the 17th century the gayest and most luxurious spot in the island. It was not unusual for the whole court and cabinet to go down to the meetings. Jewellers and milliners, players and fiddlers, venal wits and venal beauties followed in crowds. The streets were made impassable by coaches and six. In the places of public resort, peers flirted with maids of honour, and officers of the Life Guards, all plumes and gold lace, jostled professors in trencher caps and black gowns. For the neighbouring University of Cambridge always sent her highest functionaries with loyal addresses, and selected her ablest theologians to preach before the Sovereign and his splendid retinue. In the wild days of the Restoration, indeed, the most learned and eloquent divine might fail to draw a fashionable audience, particularly if Buckingham announced his intention of holding forth, for sometimes his Grace would enliven the dullness of a Sunday morning by addressing to the bevy of fine gentlemen and fine ladies a ribald exhortation which he called a sermon. But the court of King William was more decent, and the academic dignitaries were treated with marked respect. With lords and ladies from St. James and Soho, and with doctors from Trinity College and King's College, were mingled the provincial aristocracy, fox-hunting squires and their rosy-cheeked daughters, who had come in queer-looking family coaches, drawn by cart-horses from the remotest parishes of 3 or 4 counties, to see their sovereign. The heath was fringed by a wild, gipsy-like camp of vast extent. For the hope of being able to feed on the leavings of many sumptuous tables, and to pick up some of the guineas and crowns which the spendthrifts of London were throwing about, attracted thousands of peasants from a circle of many miles. William, after holding his court a few days at this joyous place, and receiving the homage of Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire and Suffolk, proceeded to Althorpe. It seems strange that he should, in the course of what was really a canvassing tour, have honoured with such a mark of favour a man so generally distrusted and hated as Sunderland. But the people were determined to be pleased. All Northamptonshire crowded to kiss the royal hand in that fine gallery which had been embellished by the pencil of Van Dyck and made classical by the muse of Waller, and the Earl tried to conciliate his neighbours by feasting them at 8 tables, all blazing with plate. From Althorpe the King proceeded to Stamford. The Earl of Exeter, whose princely seat was, and still is, one of the great sights of England, had never taken the oaths, and had, in order to avoid an interview which must have been disagreeable, found some pretext for going up to London, but had left directions that the illustrious guest should be received with fitting hospitality. William was fond of architecture and of gardening, and his nobles could not flatter him more than by asking his opinion about the improvement of their country seats. At a time when he had many cares pressing on his mind, he took a great interest in the building of Castle Howard, and a wooden model of that edifice, the finest specimen of a vicious style, was sent to Kensington for his inspection. We cannot therefore wonder that he should have seen Burghley with delight. He was indeed not content with one view, but rose early on the following morning for the purpose of examining the building a second time. From Stamford he went on to Lincoln, where he was greeted by the clergy in full canonicals, by the magistrates in scarlet robes, and by a multitude of baronets, knights and esquires from all parts of the immense plain which lies between the Trent and the German Ocean. After attending divine service in the magnificent cathedral, he took his departure and journeyed eastward. On the frontier of Nottinghamshire, the Lord Lieutenant of the county, John Hollis, Duke of Newcastle, with a great following, met the royal carriages and escorted them to his seat at Welbeck, a mansion surrounded by gigantic oaks, which scarcely seem older now than on the day when that splendid procession passed under their shade. The house in which William was then, during a few hours, a guest, passed long after his death by female descents from the Hollises to the Harleys, and from the Harleys to the Bentinks, and now contains the originals of those singularly interesting letters which passed between him and his trusty friend and servant, Portland. At Welbeck the grandees of the North were assembled. The Lord Mayor of York came thither with a train of magistrates, and the Archbishop of York with a train of divines. William hunted several times in that forest, the finest in the kingdom, which in old times gave shelter to Robin Hood and Little John, and which is now portioned out into the princely domains of Welbeck, Thoresby, Clumber and Worksop. 400 gentlemen on horseback partook of his sport. The Nottinghamshire squires were delighted to hear him say at table, after a noble stag chase, that he hoped this was not the last run which he should have with them, and that he must hire a hunting box along their delightful woods. He then turned southward. He was entertained during one day by the Earl of Stamford at Bradgate, the place where Lady Jane Grey, sat alone reading the last words of Socrates, while the deer was flying through the park, followed by the whirlwind of hounds and hunters. On the morrow the Lord Brooke welcomed his sovereign to Warwick Castle, the finest of those fortresses of the Middle Ages which have been turned into peaceful dwellings. Guy's Tower was illuminated. 120 gallons of punch were drunk to his Majesty's health, and a mighty pile of faggots blazed in the middle of the spacious court, overhung by ruins green with the ivy of centuries. The next morning the King, accompanied by a multitude of Warwickshire gentlemen on horseback, proceeded towards the borders of Gloucestershire. He deviated from his route to dine with Shrewsbury at a secluded mansion in the Wolds, and in the evening went on to Burford. The whole population of Burford met him and entreated him to accept a small token of their love. Burford was then renowned for its saddles. One inhabitant of the town in particular was said by the English to be the best saddler in Europe. 2 of his masterpieces were respectfully offered to William, who received them with much grace, and ordered them to be especially reserved for his own use. At Oxford he was received with great pomp, complimented in a Latin oration, presented with some of the most beautiful productions of the academic press, entertained with music, and invited to a sumptuous feast in the Sheldonian Theatre. He departed in a few hours, pleading as an excuse for the shortness of his stay that he had seen the colleges before, and that this was a visit not of curiosity but of kindness. As it was well known that he did not love the Oxonians, and was not loved by them, his haste gave occasion to some idle rumours which found credit with the vulgar. It was said that he hurried away without tasting the costly banquet which had been provided for him, because he had been warned by an anonymous letter that if he ate or drank in the theatre he was a dead man. But it is difficult to believe that a prince who could scarcely be induced, by the most earnest entreaty of his friends, to take the most common precautions against assassins of whose designs he had trustworthy evidence, would have been scared by so silly a hoax, and it is quite certain that the stages of his progress had been marked, and that he remained at Oxford as long as was compatible with arrangements previously made. He was welcomed back to his capital by a splendid show, which had been prepared at great cost during his absence. Sidney, now Earl of Romney and Master of the Ordnance, had determined to astonish London by an exhibition which had never been seen in England on so large a scale. The whole skill of the pyrotechnists of his department was employed to produce a display of fireworks which might vie with any that had been seen in the gardens of Versailles or on the great tank at the Hague. St. James Square was selected as the place for the spectacle. All the stately mansions on the northern, eastern and western sides were crowded with people of fashion. The King appeared at a window of Romney's drawing-room. The Princess of Denmark, her husband and her court occupied a neighbouring house. The whole diplomatic body assembled at the dwelling of the Minister of the United Provinces. A huge pyramid of flame in the centre of the area threw out brilliant cascades which were seen by hundreds of thousands who crowded the neighbouring streets and parks. The States General were informed by their correspondent that, great as the multitude was, the night had passed without the slightest disturbance. By this time the elections were almost completed. In every part of the country it had been manifest that the constituent bodies were generally zealous for the King and for the war. The City of London, which had returned 4 Tories in 1690, returned 4 Whigs in 1695. Of the proceedings at Westminster, an account more than usually circumstantial has come down to us. In 1690, the electors, disgusted by the Sacheverell clause, had returned 2 Tories. In 1695, as soon as it was known that a new Parliament was likely to be called, a meeting was held, at which it was resolved that a deputation should be sent with an invitation to 2 Commissioners of the Treasury, Charles Montague and Sir Stephen Fox. Sir Walter Clarges stood on the Tory interest. On the day of nomination near 5,000 electors paraded the city on horseback. They were divided into 3 bands, and at the head of each band rode one of the candidates. It was easy to estimate at a glance the comparative strength of the parties, for the cavalcade which followed Clarges was the least numerous of the 3, and it was well known that the followers of Montague would vote for Fox, and the followers of Fox for Montague. The business of the day was interrupted by loud clamours. The Whigs cried shame on the Jacobite candidate who wished to make the English go to mass, eat frogs, and wear wooden shoes. The Tories hooted the 2 placemen who were raising great estates out of the plunder of the poor overburdened nation. From words the incensed factions proceeded to blows, and there was a riot which was with some difficulty quelled. The High Bailiff then walked round the 3 companies of horsemen, and pronounced on the view that Montague and Fox were duly elected. A poll was demanded. The Tories exerted themselves strenuously. Neither money nor ink was spared. Clarges disbursed £2,000 in a few hours, a great outlay in times when the average income of a member of Parliament was not estimated at more than £800 a year. In the course of the night which followed the nomination, broadsides filled with invectives against the 2 courtly upstarts who had raised themselves by knavery from poverty and obscurity to opulence and power were scattered all over the capital. The Bishop of London canvassed openly against the government, for the interference of peers in elections had not yet been declared by the Commons to be a breach of privilege. But all was vain. Clarges was at the bottom of the poll without hope of rising. He withdrew, and Montague was carried on the shoulders of an immense multitude from Westminster Abbey to his office at Whitehall. The same feeling exhibited itself in many other places. The freeholders of Cumberland instructed their representatives to support the King, and to vote whatever supplies might be necessary for the purpose of carrying on the war with vigour, and this example was followed by several counties and towns. Russell did not arrive in England till after the writs had gone out, but he had only to choose for what place he would sit. His popularity was immense, for his villainies were secret, and his public services were universally known. He had won the Battle of La Hogue. He had commanded 2 years in the Mediterranean. He had there shut up the French fleets in the harbour of Toulon, and had stopped and turned back the French armies in Catalonia. He had taken many vessels, and among them 2 ships of the line, and he had not, during his long absence in a remote sea, lost a single vessel either by war or by weather. He had made the Red Cross of St. George an object of terror to all the princes and commonwealths of Italy. The effect of his successes was that embassies were on their way from Florence, Genoa, and Venice. With tardy congratulations to William on his accession, Russell's merits artfully magnified by the Whigs, made such an impression that he was returned to Parliament, not only by Portsmouth, where his official station gave him great influence, and by Cambridgeshire, where his private property was considerable, but also by Middlesex. This last distinction, indeed, he owed chiefly to the name which he bore. Before his arrival in England, it had been generally thought that 2 Tories would be returned for the metropolitan county. Somers and Shrewsbury were of opinion that the only way to avert such a misfortune was to conjure with the names of the most virtuous of all the martyrs of English liberty. They entreated Lady Russell to suffer her eldest son, a boy of 15, who was about to commence his studies at Cambridge, to be put in nomination. He must, they said, drop for one day his new title of Marquess of Tavistock, and call himself Lord Russell. There will be no expense, there will be no contest. Thousands of gentlemen on horseback will escort him to the hustings. Nobody will dare to stand against him, and he will not only come in himself, but bring in another Whig. The widowed mother, in a letter written with all the excellent sense and feeling which distinguished her, refused to sacrifice her son to the party. His education, she said, would be interrupted. His head would be turned. His triumph would be his undoing. Just at this conjuncture the Admiral arrived. He made his appearance before the freeholders of Middlesex assembled on the top of Hampstead Hill, and was returned without opposition. End of section 8. Of chapter 21 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, chapter 21, section 9. Meanwhile, several noted malcontents received marks of public disapprobation. John Knight, the most factious and insolent of those Jacobites who had dishonestly sworn fealty to King William in order to qualify themselves to sit in Parliament, ceased to represent the great city of Bristol. Exeter, the capital of the West, was violently agitated. It had been long supposed that the ability, the eloquence, the experience, the ample fortune, the noble descent of Seymour would make it impossible to upseat him. But his moral character, which had never stood very high, had, during the last 3 or 4 years, been constantly sinking. He had been virulent in opposition till he had got a place. While he had a place, he had defended the most unpopular acts of the government. As soon as he was out of place, he had again been virulent in opposition. His saltpetre contract had left a deep stain on his personal honour. 2 candidates were therefore brought forward against him, and a contest, the longest and fiercest of that age, fixed the attention of the whole kingdom, and was watched with interest even by foreign governments. The poll was open 5 weeks. The expense on both sides was enormous. The freemen of Exeter, who, while the election lasted, fared sumptuously every day, were by no means impatient for the termination of their luxurious carnival. They ate and drank heartily. They turned out every evening with good cudgels to fight for Mother Church or for King William, but the votes came in very slowly. It was not till the eve of the meeting of Parliament that the return was made. Seymour was defeated, to his bitter mortification, and was forced to take refuge in the small borough of Totnes. It is remarkable that, at this election as at the preceding election, John Hampden failed to obtain a seat. He had, since he ceased to be a member of Parliament, been brooding over his evil fate and his indelible shame, and occasionally venting his spleen in bitter pamphlets against the government. When the Whigs had become predominant at the Court and in the House of Commons, when Nottingham had retired, when Carmarthen had been impeached, Hampden, it should seem, again conceived the hope that he might play a greater part in public life. But the leaders of his party apparently did not wish for an ally of so acrimonious and turbulent a spirit. He found himself still excluded from the House of Commons. He led, during a few months, a miserable life, sometimes trying to forget his cares among the well-bred gamblers and frail beauties who filled the drawing-room of the Duchess of Mazarine, and sometimes sunk in religious melancholy. The thought of suicide often rose in his mind. Soon there was a vacancy in the representation of Buckinghamshire, the county which had repeatedly sent himself and his progenitors to Parliament, and he expected that he should, by the help of Wharton, whose dominion over the Buckinghamshire Whigs was absolute, be returned without difficulty. Wharton, however, gave his interest to another candidate. This was a final blow. The town was agitated by the news that John Hampden had cut his throat, that he had survived his wound a few hours, that he had professed deep penitence for his sins, had requested the prayers of Burnet, and had sent a solemn warning to the Duchess of Mazarine. A coroner's jury found a verdict of insanity. The wretched man had entered on life with the fairest prospects. He bore a name which was more than noble. He was heir to an ample estate and to a patrimony much more precious, the confidence and attachment of hundreds of thousands of his countrymen. His own abilities were considerable, and had been carefully cultivated. Unhappily, ambition and party spirit impelled him to place himself in a situation full of danger. To that danger his fortitude proved unequal. He stooped to supplications which saved him and dishonoured him. From that moment he never knew peace of mind. His temper became perverse, and his understanding was perverted by his temper. He tried to find relief in devotion and in revenge, in fashionable dissipation and in political turmoil. But the dark shade never passed away from his mind, till, in the 12th year of his humiliation, his unhappy life was terminated by an unhappy death. The result of the general election proved that William had chosen a fortunate moment for dissolving. The number of new members was about 160, and most of these were known to be thoroughly well affected to the government. It was of the highest importance that the House of Commons should at that moment be disposed to cooperate cordially with the King, for it was absolutely necessary to apply a remedy to an internal evil which had by slow degrees grown to a fearful magnitude. The silver coin, which was then the standard coin of the realm, was in a state at which the boldest and most enlightened statesmen stood aghast. Till the reign of Charles II, our coin had been struck by a process as old as the 13th century. Edward I had invited hither skilful artists from Florence, which in his time was to London what London in the time of William III was to Moscow. During many generations the instruments which were then introduced into our mint continued to be employed with little alteration. The metal was divided with shears, and afterwards shaped and stamped by the hammer. In these operations much was left to the hand and eye of the workman. It necessarily happened that some pieces contained a little more, and some a little less than the just quantity of silver. Few pieces were exactly round, and the rims were not marked. It was therefore, in the course of years, discovered that to clip the coin was one of the easiest and most profitable kinds of fraud. In the reign of Elizabeth it had been thought necessary to enact that the clipper should be, as the coiner had long been, liable to the penalties of high treason. The practice of paring down money, however, was far too lucrative to be so checked, and, about the time of the Restoration, people began to observe that a large proportion of the crowns, half-crowns and shillings, which were passing from hand to hand, had undergone some slight mutilation. That was a time fruitful of experiments and inventions in all the departments of science. A great improvement in the mode of shaping and striking the coin was suggested. A mill, which to a great extent superseded the human hand, was set up in the Tower of London. This mill was worked by horses, and would doubtless be considered by modern engineers as a rude and feeble machine. The pieces which it produced, however, were among the best in Europe. It was not easy to counterfeit them, and as their shape was exactly circular, and their edges were inscribed with a legend, clipping was not to be apprehended. The hammered coins and the milled coins were current together. They were received without distinction in public, and consequently in private payments. The financiers of that age seem to have expected that the new money, which was excellent, would soon displace the old money, which was much impaired. Yet any man of plain understanding might have known that, when the state treats perfect coin and light coin as of equal value, the perfect coin will not drive the light coin out of circulation, but will itself be driven out. A clipped crown on English ground went as far in the payment of a tax or a debt as a milled crown, but the milled crown, as soon as it had been flung into the crucible or carried across the channel, became much more valuable than the clipped crown. It might therefore have been predicted, as confidently as anything can be predicted which depends on the human will, that the inferior pieces would remain in the only market in which they could fetch the same price as the superior pieces, and that the superior pieces would take some form, or fly to some place in which some advantage could be derived from their superiority. The politicians of that age, however, generally overlooked these very obvious considerations. They marvelled exceedingly that everybody should be so perverse as to use light money in preference to good money. In other words, they marvelled that nobody chose to pay 12 ounces of silver when 10 would serve the turn. The horse in the Tower still paced his rounds. Fresh waggon loads of choice money still came forth from the mill, and still they vanished as fast as they appeared. Great masses were melted down, great masses exported, great masses hoarded, but scarcely one new piece was to be found in the till of a shop, or in the leathern bag which the farmer carried home from the cattle fair. In the receipts and payments of the Exchequer, the milled money did not exceed 10 shillings in 100 pounds. A writer of that age mentions the case of a merchant who, in a sum of 35 pounds, received only a single half-crown in milled silver. Meanwhile the shears of the clippers were constantly at work. The combers, too, multiplied and prospered, for the worse the current money became, the more easily it was imitated. During more than 30 years this evil had gone on increasing. At first it had been disregarded, but it had at length become an unsupportable curse to the country. It was to no purpose that the rigorous laws against coining and clipping were rigorously executed. At every session that was held at the Old Bailey, terrible examples were made. Hurdles with 4, 5, 6 wretches convicted of counterfeiting or mutilating the money of the realm were dragged, month after month, up Holborn Hill. On one morning 7 men were hanged, and a woman burned for clipping. But all was vain. The gains were such as to lawless spirits seemed more than proportioned to the risks. Some clippers were said to have made great fortunes. One in particular offered £6,000 for a pardon. His bribe was indeed rejected, but the fame of his riches did much to counteract the effect which the spectacle of his death was designed to produce. Nay, the severity of the punishment gave encouragement to the crime. For the practice of clipping, pernicious as it was, did not excite in the common mind a detestation resembling that with which men regard murder, arson, robbery, nay, even theft. The injury done by the whole body of clippers to the whole society was indeed immense, but each particular act of clipping was a trifle. To pass a half-crown, after paring a pennyworth of silver from it, seemed a minute and almost imperceptible fault. Even while the nation was crying out most loudly under the distress which the state of the currency had produced, every individual who was capitally punished for contributing to bring the currency into that state had the general sympathy on his side. Constables were unwilling to arrest the offenders. Justices were unwilling to commit. Witnesses were unwilling to tell the whole truth. Juries were unwilling to pronounce the word guilty. It was vain to tell the common people that the mutilators of the coin were causing far more misery than all the highwaymen and housebreakers in the island. For, great as the aggregate of the evil was, only an infinitesimal part of that evil was brought home to the individual malefactor. There was, therefore, a general conspiracy to prevent the law from taking its course. The convictions, numerous as they might seem, were few indeed when compared with the offences, and the offenders who were convicted looked on themselves as murdered men, and were firm in the belief that their sin, if sin it were, was as venial as that of a schoolboy who goes nutting in the wood of a neighbour. All the eloquence of the ordinary could seldom induce them to conform to the wholesome usage of acknowledge in their dying speeches the enormity of their wickedness. The evil proceeded with constantly accelerating velocity. At length, in the autumn of 1695, it could hardly be said that the country possessed, for practical purposes, any measure of the value of commodities. It was a mere chance whether what was called a shilling was really 10pence, 6pence, or a groat. The results of some experiments which were tried at that time deserve to be mentioned. The officers of the Exchequer weighed 57,200 of hammered money which had recently been paid in. The weight ought to have been above 220,000 ounces. It proved to be under 114,000 ounces. 3 eminent London goldsmiths were invited to send £100 each in current silver to be tried by the balance. £300 ought to have weighed about 1200 ounces. The actual weight proved to be 624 ounces. The same test was applied in various parts of the kingdom. It was found that £100, which should have weighed about 400 ounces, did actually weigh at Bristol 240 ounces, at Cambridge 203, at Exeter 180, and at Oxford only 116. There were indeed some northern districts into which the clipped money had only begun to find its way. An honest Quaker who lived in one of those districts recorded in some notes which are still extant the amazement with which, when he travelled southward, shopkeepers and innkeepers stared at the broad and heavy half-crowns with which he paid his way. They asked whence he came, and where such money was to be found. The guinea which he purchased for 22 shillings at Lancaster bore a different value at every stage of his journey. When he reached London it was worth 30 shillings, and would indeed have been worth more had not the government fixed that rate as the highest at which gold should be received in the payment of taxes. The evils produced by this state of the currency were not such as have generally been thought worthy to occupy a prominent place in history. Yet it may well be doubted whether all the misery which had been inflicted on the English nation in a quarter of a century by bad kings, bad ministers, bad parliaments, and bad judges, was equal to the misery caused in a single year by bad crowns and bad shillings. Those events which furnish the best themes for pathetic or indignant eloquence are not always those which most affect the happiness of the great body of the people. The misgovernment of Charles and James, gross as it had been, had not prevented the common business of life from going steadily and prosperously on. While the honour and independence of the state were sold to a foreign power, while chartered rights were invaded, while fundamental laws were violated, hundreds of thousands of quiet, honest, and industrious families laboured and traded, ate their meals and lay down to rest in comfort and security. Whether Whigs or Tories, Protestants or Jesuits were uppermost, the grazier drove his beasts to market, the grocer weighed out his currants, the draper measured out his broadcloth. The hum of buyers and sellers was as loud as ever in the towns. The harvest home was celebrated as joyously as ever in the hamlets. The cream overflowed the pails of Cheshire. The apple juice foamed in the presses of Herefordshire. The piles of crockery glowed in the furnaces of the Trent, and the barrows of coal rolled fast along the timber railways of the Tyne. But when the great instrument of exchange became thoroughly deranged, all trade, all industry were smitten as with a palsy. The evil was felt daily and hourly in almost every place and by almost every class, in the dairy and on the threshing floor, by the anvil and by the loom, on the billows of the ocean and in the depths of the mine. Nothing could be purchased without a dispute. Over every counter there was wrangling from morning to night. The workman and his employer had a quarrel as regularly as the Saturday came round. On a fair day or a market day, the clamours, the reproaches, the taunts, the curses were incessant, and it was well if no booth was overturned and no head broken. No merchant would contract to deliver goods without making some stipulation about the quality of the coin in which he was to be paid. Even men of business were often bewildered by the confusion into which all pecuniary transactions were thrown. The simple and the careless were pillaged without mercy by extortioners whose demands grew even more rapidly than the money shrank. The price of the necessaries of life, of shoes, of ale, of oatmeal, rose fast. The labourer found that the bit of metal, which when he received it was called a shilling, would hardly, when he wanted to purchase a pot of beer or a loaf of rye bread, go as far as sixpence. Where artisans of more than usual intelligence were collected together in great numbers, as in the dockyard at Chatham, they were able to make their complaints heard and to obtain some redress. But the ignorant and helpless peasant was cruelly ground between one class which would give money only by tally, and another which would take it only by weight. Yet his sufferings hardly exceeded those of the unfortunate race of authors. Of the way in which obscure writers were treated, we may easily form a judgment from the letters still extant of Dryden to his bookseller Tonson. One day Tonson sends 40 brass shillings, to say nothing of clipped money. Another day he pays a debt with pieces so bad that none of them will go. The great poet sends them all back, and demands in their place guineas at 29 shillings each. I expect, he says in one letter, good silver, not such as I have had formerly. If you have any silver that will go, he says in another letter, my wife will be glad of it. I lost 30 shillings or more by the last payment of £50. These complaints and demands, which have been preserved from destruction only by the eminence of the writer, are doubtless merely a fair sample of the correspondence which filled all the mail bags of England during several months. In the midst of the public distress, one class prospered greatly, the bankers, and among the bankers none could in skill or luck bear a comparison with Charles Duncombe. He had been, not many years before, a goldsmith of very moderate wealth. He had probably, after the fashion of his craft, plied for customers under the arcades of the Royal Exchange, had saluted merchants with profound bows, and had begged to be allowed the honour of keeping their cash. But so dexterously did he now avail himself of the opportunities of profit which the general confusion of prices gave to a money changer, that at the moment when the trade of the kingdom was depressed to the lowest point, he laid down nearly £90,000 for the estate of Helmsley in the North Riding of Yorkshire. That great property had, in a troubled time, been bestowed by the Commons of England on their victorious General Fairfax, and had been part of the dower which Fairfax's daughter had brought to the brilliant and dissolute Buckingham. Thither Buckingham, having wasted in mad intemperance, sensual and intellectual, all the choicest bounties of nature and of fortune, had carried the feeble ruins of his fine person and of his fine mind, and there he had closed his chequered life under that humble roof and on that coarse pallet which the great satirist of the succeeding generation described in immortal verse. The spacious domain passed to a new race, and in a few years a palace more splendid and costly than had ever been inhabited by the magnificent Villiers rose amidst the beautiful woods and waters which had been his, and was called by the once humble name of Duncombe. Section 9. 10 of Chapter 21 of the History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 21, Section 10. Since the Revolution, the state of the currency had been repeatedly discussed in Parliament. In 1689, a committee of the Commons had been appointed to investigate the subject, but had made no report. In 1690, another committee had reported that immense quantities of silver were carried out of the country by Jews, who, it was said, would do anything for profit. Schemes were formed for encouraging the importation and discouraging the exportation of the precious metals. One foolish bill after another was brought in and dropped. At length, in the beginning of the year 1695, the question assumed so serious an aspect that the Houses applied themselves to it in earnest. The only practical result of their deliberations, however, was a new penal law, which it was hoped would prevent the clipping of the hammered coin and the melting and exporting of the milled coin. It was enacted that every person who informed against a clipper should be entitled to a reward of £40, that every clipper who informed against two clippers should be entitled to a pardon, and that whoever should be found in possession of silver filings or parings should be burned in the cheek with a red-hot iron. Certain officers were empowered to search for bullion. If bullion were found in a house or on board of a ship, the burden of proving that it had never been part of the money of the realm was thrown on the owner. If he failed in making out a satisfactory history of every ingot, he was liable to severe penalties. This act was, as might have been expected, altogether ineffective. During the following summer and autumn, the coins went on dwindling, and the cry of distress from every county in the realm became louder and more piercing. But happily for England, there were among her rulers some who clearly perceived that it was not by halters and branding irons that her decaying industry and commerce could be restored to health. The state of the currency had during some time occupied the serious attention of four eminent men closely connected by public and private ties. Two of them were politicians who had never, in the midst of official and parliamentary business, ceased to love and honour philosophy, and two were philosophers, in whom habits of abstruse meditation had not impaired the homely good sense without which even genius is mischievous in politics. Never had there been an occasion which more urgently required both practical and speculative abilities, and never had the world seen the highest practical and the highest speculative abilities united in an alliance so close, so harmonious, and so honourable as that which bound Somers and Montague to Locke and Newton. It is much to be lamented that we have not a minute history of the conferences of the men to whom England owed the restoration of her currency and the long series of prosperous years which dates from that restoration. It would be interesting to see how the pure gold of scientific truth found by the two philosophers was mingled by the two statesmen with just that quantity of alloy which was necessary for the working. It would be curious to study the many plans which were propounded, discussed, and rejected, some as inefficacious, some as unjust, some as too costly, some as too hazardous, till at length a plan was devised, of which the wisdom was provided by the best evidence, complete success. Newton has left to posterity no exposition of his opinions touching the currency. But the tracts of Locke on this subject are happily still extant, and it may be doubted whether in any of his writings, even in those ingenious and deeply meditated chapters on language which form, perhaps, the most valuable part of the essay on human understanding, the force of his mind appears more conspicuously. Whether he had ever been acquainted with Dudley North is not known. In moral character the two men bore little resemblance to each other. They belonged to different parties. Indeed, had not Locke taken shelter from tyranny in Holland, it is by no means impossible that he might have been sent to Tyburn by a jury which Dudley North had packed. Intellectually, however, there was much in common between the Tory and the Whig. They had laboriously thought out, each for himself, a theory of political economy, substantially the same with that which Adam Smith afterwards expounded. Nay, in some respects the theory of Locke and North was more complete and symmetrical than that of their illustrious successor. Adam Smith has often been justly blamed for maintaining, in direct opposition to all his own principles, that the rate of interest ought to be regulated by the state, and he is the more blamable because, long before he was born, both Locke and North had taught that it was as absurd to make laws fixing the price of money as to make laws fixing the price of cutlery or of broadcloth. Dudley North died in 1693. A short time before his death he published, without his name, a small tract which contains a concise sketch of a plan for the restoration of the currency. This plan appears to have been substantially the same with that which was afterwards fully developed and ably defended by Locke. One question, which was doubtless the subject of many anxious deliberations, was whether anything should be done while the war lasted. In whatever way the restoration of the coin might be effected, great sacrifices must be made, the whole community, or by a part of the community. And to call for such sacrifices at a time when the nation was already paying taxes such as, 10 years before, no financier would have thought it possible to raise, was undoubtedly a course full of danger. Timorous politicians were for delay, but the deliberate conviction of the great Whig leaders was that something must be hazarded, or that everything was lost. Montague, in particular, is said to have expressed in strong language his determination to kill or cure. If indeed there had been any hope that the evil would merely continue to be what it was, it might have been wise to defer till the return of peace an experiment which must severely try the strength of the body politic. But the evil was one which daily made progress almost visible to the eye. There might have been a recoinage in 1691 with half the risk which must be run in 1696, and great as would be the risk in 1696, that risk would be doubled if the coinage were postponed till 1698. Those politicians whose voice was for delay gave less trouble than another set of politicians who were for a general and immediate recoinage, but who insisted that the new shilling should be worth only 9p. or 9p. halfpenny. At the head of this party was William Lowndes, Secretary of the Treasury and Member of Parliament for the borough of Seaford, a most respectable and industrious public servant, but much more versed in the details of his office than in the higher parts of political philosophy. He was not in the least aware that a piece of metal with the King's head on it was a commodity of which the price was governed by the same laws which govern the price of a piece of metal fashioned into a spoon or a buckle, and that it was no more in the power of Parliament to make the kingdom richer by calling a crown a pound than to make the kingdom larger by calling a furlong a mile. He seriously believed, incredible as it may seem, that if the ounce of silver were divided into 7 shillings instead of 5, foreign nations would sell us their wines and their silks for a smaller number of ounces. He had a considerable following, composed partly of dull men who really believed what he told them, and partly of shrewd men who were perfectly willing to be authorized by law to pay £100 with 80. Had his arguments prevailed, the evils of a vast confiscation would have been added to all the other evils which afflicted the nation. Public credit, still in its tender and sickly infancy, would have been destroyed, and there would have been much risk of a general mutiny by the fleet and army. Happily, Lowndes was completely refuted by Locke in a paper drawn up for the use of Somers. Somers was delighted with this little treatise, and desired that it might be printed. It speedily became the textbook of all the most enlightened politicians in the kingdom, and may still be read with pleasure and profit. The effect of Locke's forcible and perspicuous reasoning is greatly heightened by his evident anxiety to get at the truth, and by the singularly generous and graceful courtesy with which he treats an antagonist of powers far inferior to his own. Flamsteed, the astronomer royal, described the controversy well by saying that the point in dispute was whether 5 was 6 or only 5. Thus far Somers and Montague entirely agreed with Locke. But as to the manner in which the restoration of the currency ought to be effected, there was some difference of opinion. Locke recommended, as Dudley North had recommended, that the King should, by proclamation, fix a near day after which the hammered money should in all payments pass only by weight. The advantages of this plan were doubtless great and obvious. It was most simple, and at the same time most efficient. What searching, fining, branding, hanging, burning had failed to do would be done in an instant. The clipping of the hammered pieces, the melting of the milled pieces, would cease. Great quantities of good coin would come forth from secret drawers and from behind the panels of wainscots. The mutilated silver would gradually flow into the mint, and would come forth again in a form which would make mutilation impossible. In a short time the whole currency of the realm would be in a sound state, and during the progress of this great change there would never at any moment be any scarcity of money. These were weighty considerations, and to the joint authority of North and Locke on such a question great respect is due. Yet it must be owned that their plan was open to one serious objection, which did not indeed altogether escape their notice, but of which they seem to have thought too lightly. The restoration of the currency was a benefit to the whole community. On what principle, then, was the expense of restoring the currency to be borne by a part of the community? It was most desirable, doubtless, that the words pound and shilling should again have a fixed signification, that every man should know what his contracts meant and what his property was worth. But was it just to attain this excellent end, by means of which the effect would be that every farmer who had put by £100 to pay his rent, every trader who had scraped together £100 to meet his acceptances, would find his £100 reduced in a moment to 50 or 60? It was not the fault of such a farmer or of such a trader that his crowns and half-crowns were not of full weight. The government itself was to blame. The evil which the state had caused, the state was bound to repair, and it would evidently have been wrong to throw the charge of the reparation on a particular class merely because that class was so situated that it could conveniently be pillaged. It would have been as reasonable to require the timber merchants to bear the whole cost of fitting out the Channel fleet, or the gunsmiths to bear the whole cost of supplying arms to the regiments in Flanders, as to restore the currency of the kingdom at the expense of those individuals in whose hands the clipped sliver happened at a particular moment to be. Locke declared that he regretted the loss which, if his advice were taken, would fall on the holders of the short money. But it appeared to him that the nation must make a choice between evils, and in truth it was much easier to lay down the general proposition that the expenses of restoring the currency ought to be borne by the public than to devise any mode in which they could, without extreme inconvenience and danger, be so borne. Was it to be announced that every person should, within a term of a year or a half, carry to the mint a clipped crown, should receive in exchange for it a milled crown, and that the difference between the value of the two pieces should be made good out of the public purse? That would be to offer a premium for clipping. The shears would be more busy than ever. The short money would every day become shorter. The difference which the taxpayers would have to make good would probably be greater by 1,000,000 at the end of the term than at the beginning, and the whole of this 1,000,000 would go to reward malefactors. If the time allowed for the bringing in of the hammered coin were much shortened, the danger of further clipping would be proportionally diminished, but another danger would be incurred. The silver would flow into the mint so much faster than it could possibly flow out, that there must, during some months, be a grievous scarcity of money. A singularly bold and ingenious expedient occurred to Somers and was approved by William. It was that a proclamation should be prepared with great secrecy and published at once in all parts of the kingdom. This proclamation was to announce that hammered coins would thenceforth pass only by weight, but every possessor of such coins was to be invited to deliver them up within 3 days in a sealed packet to the public authorities. The coins were to be examined, numbered, weighed, and returned to the owner, with a promissory note entitling him to receive from the Treasury, at a future time, the difference between the actual quantity of silver in his pieces and the quantity of silver which, according to the standard, those pieces ought to have contained. Had this plan been adopted, an immediate stop would have been put to the clipping, the melting, and the exporting, and the expense of the restoration of the currency would have been borne, as was right, by the public. The inconvenience arising from a scarcity of money would have been of very short duration, for the mutilated pieces would have been detained only till they could be told and weighted. They would then have been sent back into circulation, and the recoinage would have taken place gradually and without any perceptible suspension or disturbance of trade. But against these great advantages were to be set off hazards, which Somerset was prepared to brave, but from which it is not strange that politicians of less elevated character should have shrunk. The course which he recommended to his colleagues was indeed the safest for the country, but was by no means the safest for themselves. His plan could not be successful unless the execution were sudden. The execution could not be sudden if the previous sanction of Parliament were asked and obtained, and to take a step of such fearful importance without the previous sanction of Parliament was to run the risk of censure, impeachment, imprisonment, ruin. The King and the Lord Keeper were alone in the Council, Even Montague quailed, and it was determined to do nothing without the authority of the legislature. Montague undertook to submit to the Commons a scheme which was not indeed without dangers and inconveniences, but which was probably the best which he could hope to carry. On the 22nd of November the Houses met. Foley was on that day again chosen Speaker. On the following day he was presented and approved. The King opened the session with a speech very skilfully framed. He congratulated his hearers on the success of the campaign on the Continent. That success he attributed, in language which must have gratified their feelings, to the bravery of the English army. He spoke of the evils which had arisen from the deplorable state of the coin, and of the necessity of applying a speedy remedy. He intimated very plainly his opinion that the expense of restoring the currency ought to be borne by the State, but he declared that he referred the whole matter to the wisdom of his great council. Before he concluded, he addressed himself particularly to the newly elected House of Commons, and warmly expressed his approbation of the excellent choice which his people had made. His speech was received with a low but very significant hum of assent from both above and below the bar, and was as favourably received by the public as by the Parliament. In the Commons an address of thanks was moved by Wharton, faintly opposed by Musgrave, adopted without division, and carried up by the whole House to Kensington. At the palace the loyalty of the crowd of gentlemen showed itself in a way which would now be thought hardly consistent with senatorial gravity. When refreshments were handed round in the antechamber, the Speaker filled his glass and proposed two toasts: the health of King William and confusion to King Lewis, and both were drunk with loud acclamations. Yet near observers could perceive that, though the representatives of the nation were as a body zealous for civil liberty and for the Protestant religion, and though they were prepared to endure everything rather than see their country again reduced to vassalage, they were anxious and dispirited. All were thinking of the state of the coin, all were saying that something must be done, and all acknowledged that they did not know what could be done. "I am afraid," said a member who expressed what many felt, "that the nation can bear neither the disease nor the cure." There was indeed a minority by which the difficulties and dangers of that crisis were seen with malignant delight, and of that minority the keenest, boldest, and most factious leader was Howe, whom poverty had made more acrimonious than ever. He moved that the House should resolve itself into a committee on the state of the nation, and the Ministry, for that word may now with propriety be used, readily consented. Indeed, the great question touching the currency could not be brought forward more conveniently than in such a committee. When the Speaker had left the chair, Howe harangued against the war as vehemently as he had in former years harangued for it. He called for peace, peace on any terms. The nation, he said, resembled a wounded man fighting desperately on, with blood flowing in torrents. During a short time the spirit might bear up the frame, but faintness must soon come on. No moral energy could long hold out against physical exhaustion. He found very little support. The great majority of his hearers were fully determined to put everything to hazard rather than submit to France. It was sneeringly remarked that the state of his own finances had suggested to him the image of a man bleeding to death, and that, if a cordial were administered to him in the form of a salary, he would trouble himself little about the drained veins of the Commonwealth. "We did not," said the Whig orators, degrade ourselves by suing for peace when our flag was chased out of our own channel, when Tourville's fleet lay at anchor in Torbay, when the Irish nation was in arms against us, when every post from the Netherlands brought news of some disaster, when we had to contend against the genius of Louvois in the cabinet and of Luxembourg in the field? And are we to turn suppliants now, when no hostile squadron dares to show itself even in the Mediterranean, when our arms are victorious on the continent, when God has removed the great statesman and the great soldier whose abilities long frustrated our efforts, and when the weakness of the French administration indicates, in a manner not to be mistaken, the ascendancy of a female favourite? Howe's suggestion was contemptuously rejected, and the committee proceeded to take into consideration the state of the currency. Meanwhile, the newly liberated presses of the capital never rested a moment. Innumerable pamphlets and broadsides about the coin lay on the counters of the booksellers, and were thrust into the hands of members of Parliament in the lobby. In one of the most curious and amusing of these pieces, Lewis and his ministers are introduced, expressing the greatest alarm lest England should make herself the richest country in the world by the simple expedients of calling ninepence a shilling, and confidently predicting that, if the old standard were maintained, there would be another revolution. Some writers vehemently objected to the proposition that the public should bear the expense of restoring the currency. Some urged the government to take this opportunity of assimilating the money of England to the money of neighbouring nations. One projector was for coining guilders, another for coining dollars. Within the walls of Parliament the debates continued during several anxious days. At length Montague, after defeating first those who were for letting things remain unaltered till the peace, and then those who were for the little shilling, carried 11 resolutions in which the outlines of his own plan were set forth. It was resolved that the money of the kingdom should be recoined according to the old standard both of weight and of fineness, that all the new pieces should be milled, that the loss on the clipped pieces should be borne by the public, that a time should be fixed after which no clipped money should pass except in payments to the government, and that at a later time should be fixed after which no clipped money should pass at all. What divisions took place in the committee cannot be ascertained. When the resolutions were reported, there was one division. It was on the question whether the old standard of weight should be maintained. The noes were 114, the ayes 225. It was ordered that a bill founded on the resolutions should be brought in. A few days later the Chancellor of the Exchequer explained to the Commons, in a committee of Ways and Means, the plan by which he proposed to meet the expense of the recoinage. It was impossible to estimate with precision the charge of making good the deficiencies of the clipped money, but it was certain that at least £1,200,000 would be required. £1,200,000 the Bank of England undertook to advance on good security. It was a maxim received among financiers that no security which the government could offer was so sound as the old hearth money had been. That tax, odious as it was to the great majority of those who paid it, was remembered with regret at the Treasury and in the City. It occurred to the Chancellor of the Exchequer that it might be possible to devise an impost on houses which might not be less productive nor less certain than the hearth money, but which might press less heavily on the poor, and might be collected by a less vexatious process. The number of hearths in a house could not be ascertained without domiciliary visits. The windows a collector might count without passing the threshold. Montague proposed that the inhabitants of cottages who had been cruelly harassed by the chimneymen should be altogether exempted from the new duty. His plan was approved by the Committee of Ways and Means, and was sanctioned by the House without a division. Such was the origin of the window tax, a tax which, though doubtless a great evil, must be considered as a blessing when compared with the curse from which it rescued the nation. Thus far things had gone smoothly, but now came a crisis which required the most skilful steering. The news that the Parliament and the government were determined on a reform of the currency produced an ignorant panic among the common people. Every man wished to get rid of his clipped crowns and half-crowns. No man liked to take them. There were brawls approaching to riots in half the streets of London. The Jacobites, always full of joy and hope in a day of adversity and public danger, ran about with eager looks and noisy tongues. The health of King James was publicly drunk in taverns and on ale benches. Many members of Parliament who had hitherto supported the government began to waver, and that nothing might be wanting to the difficulties of the conjuncture, a dispute on a point of privilege arose between the Houses. The Recoinage Bill, framed in conformity with Montague's resolutions, had gone up to the Peers and had come back with amendments, some of which, in the opinion of the Commons, their lordships had no right to make. The emergency was too serious to admit of delay. Montague brought in a new bill, which was in fact his former bill modified in some points to meet the wishes of the Lords. The Lords, though not perfectly contented with the new bill, passed it without any alteration, and the royal assent was immediately given. The 4th of May, a date long remembered over the whole kingdom, and especially in the capital, was fixed as the day on which the government would cease to receive the clipped money in payment of taxes. The principles of the Recoinage Act are excellent, but some of the details both of that Act and of a supplementary Act which was passed at a later period of the session seemed to prove that Montague had not fully considered what legislation can and what it cannot effect. For example, he persuaded the Parliament to enact that it should be penal to give or take more than 22 shillings for a guinea. It may be confidently affirmed that this enactment was not suggested or approved by Locke. He knew well that the high price of gold was not the evil which afflicted the state, but merely a symptom of that evil, and that a fall in the price of gold would inevitably follow, and could by no human power or ingenuity be made to precede the recoinage of the silver. In fact, the penalty seems to have produced no effect whatever, good or bad. Till the milled silver was in circulation, the guinea continued, in spite of the law, to pass for 30 shillings. When the milled silver became plentiful, the guinea fell, not to 22 shillings, which was the highest price allowed by the state, but to 21 shillings and sixpence. Early in February, the panic which had been caused by the first debates on the currency subsided, and from that time till the 4th of May, the want of money was not very severely felt. The recoinage began. 10 furnaces were erected in the garden behind the Treasury, and every day huge heaps of pared and defaced crowns and shillings were turned into massy ingots, which were instantly sent off to the mint in the Tower. End of section 10.